All right, welcome. Sorry, I think we're going to get started. I'm Professor Maggie Browner from Romance Language Department. Some of you know me in my role as member of the Linguistic Studies concentration, others from my department and others from other departments where I work with some of you and some of my colleagues. I wanted to welcome Kim Potowski, associate professor from the Hispanic Linguistics from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her research focuses on the Spanish of bilingual speakers, including how Spanish is spoken in the United States, the effectiveness of curricula for heritage speakers, and professional development for teachers. She's the author of numerous articles, book chapters, and books, including Language and Identity in a Dual Immersion School, the edited volume, Language Diversity in the USA, published by Cambridge University Press, and more recently, the co-edited volume, Bilingual Youth, Spanish and English Speaking Societies, published by John Benjamins. She's also executive editor of the journal Spanish in Context and co-editor of the Heritage Language Journal. But more recently, she spent a year in Oaxaca, Mexico, with support of a Fulbright grant studying the linguistic features and schooling experiences of bilingual transnational youth. She has walked many paths, but she's a passionate Spanish speaker and a real advocate for Spanish and bilingual speakers in the United States. And today she will be speaking to us on the topic of when foreign languages aren't foreign, the value of heritage speakers in the United States. And so please help me welcome her to St. Olaf.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, I'd like to thank Maggie for that introduction. As far as being passionate, it takes one to know one. Any of you who've had classes with Maggie know that she's extraordinarily passionate and extraordinarily organized. And so it is she who I would most like to thank for bringing me here today, as well as the Department of Romance Languages. And I've also had the great pleasure to meet with several faculty members, colleagues of Maggie's. I took copious notes during and after our meeting, as well as with two different classes full of students, where I also took lots of notes. So this has been an extraordinarily short but very fruitful visit for me, and we're already plotting my return. Maybe this spring I can come back for a day or two. I would really, really enjoy that. Well, what I'm here to talk to you about today is linguistic diversity in the United States. And I'm going to start off by talking about this term heritage speaker. Heritage speaker is a term that's used a lot in the field of language education. And what it means is it refers to a person who grew up in a household with exposure to a minority language. So if you are an Arabic speaker in France, right, you are often considered a heritage speaker of Arabic. If you are a speaker of any of the numerous languages in the United States that are not English, you're often considered a heritage speaker of those languages. Vietnamese in the US, Arabic in France, Hindi in the UK, these are all examples of heritage language contexts. They don't all look alike. We have a broad definition of heritage speakers and a more narrow definition of heritage speakers. But the bottom line is that they have differing proficiencies in the heritage language. Some heritage speakers can speak and write very fluently. In other words, they have literacy in the heritage language. Others can only understand, but they will speak back to you in English, but they can understand Vietnamese or Hmong or whatever the language might be. Why might they look so differently linguistically? Well, there's a number of factors. The age at which they immigrated, or if they were born here, the age at which their parents immigrated, or if it was their grandparents who in fact immigrated. The language proficiency and language use within the family. The density of the community. Were there a lot of other speakers of that language around? What kind of schooling did they have? Did they have any exposure to formal literacy in the heritage language? What context in the society was there for accepting the speakers and their language? All of these things can affect what your heritage language proficiency looks like. I'm going to be using an acronym here. LOTE, language other than English, which comes out LOTE. And I remember the first time I used this phrase in a class, a Latina student asked me why I was talking about corn. And I said, no, I'm not talking about elotes, I'm talking about lote, a language other than English. She was a little confused. We know that there are approximately 330 different languages spoken in U.S. homes. This is according to the American Community Survey. I'm going to see if you can guess. So the number one spoken language in the U.S. is English. This is quite astounding. 82% of the population says that that is the only language spoken in their home. So keep this number in mind. We're a pretty monolingual nation overall. Can anybody guess what the number one lote is? You didn't have to reach real far to guess for that one, did you? About 35 million. It depends on how you count and who you count. The percent change, of course, is large, 62% change. And that's also 62% of all of our lote speakers in the country. Okay, what do you think is the second most commonly spoken lote? Chinese, very good. We also see a large growth in the Chinese community. However, we see it's only 4% of all lote speakers in the U.S. So Spanish by far takes the cake, and Chinese would be next. What's after Chinese? Hmong? I know, I can see why here you might guess that, but not across the nation. No, Tagalog, right? Which a lot of Filipinos insist on calling Filipino, but the census calls it Tagalog, right? We also see a large growth in the Tagalog speaking community. Okay, what might be next? Throw out some languages. What do you think's in the top 10? Korean, Arabic, sorry?
Hindi.
Hindi's a good guess, not in the top 10. Russian, what else? Italian, German, Polish. You've been to Chicago, haven't you? Anything else? French, believe it or not, is next, which surprises a lot of people, but we have to keep in mind Louisiana. There are people who count as French speakers in Louisiana. Also Maine and the parts of the U.S. that border with Canada. There's a fantastic movie called Réveil. Réveil, the Awakening of French, I think is the subtitle. Poignant, beautifully made film about French heritage speakers up in that part of the country. But what do we notice about French that's different from the other languages? Decline. We see some decline in French. Next is Vietnamese. Look at that growth in the Vietnamese speaking community. German, we also see a decline. Okay. Among this community, however, we have the Amish, who often indicate that they are German speaking, which is interesting. Korean, experiencing large growth. Russian, look at that growth. We have Italian, we have a decline. Italian. Arabic, we have 73% growth. Polish is actually number 12 in the nation, number 2 in Chicago. And 11 is actually Portuguese. Right? Okay. What do you notice about the languages that are declining? They're all the European languages. So the most growth that we're seeing is in the Asian languages and in Spanish, which we could argue is also a European language, but that's not where the immigration's coming from. It's not coming from Europe. Is there a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Is it the percent of U.S. population is that speak it as a primary language or just?
No, that's the percent of the entire U.S. population.
Okay, so the percentage of the population that speak the language primarily in the household? Or
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, so here we have our top lotes, and the impact in our schools, of course, is tremendous. We know that 20% of all school-age children speak a language other than English in the home. And here are the arguments I'm gonna try to present to you, and I'm gonna try to do it in 50 minutes, we said? Okay. First of all, I may not need to convince anyone here in this room that this linguistic diversity is a resource. It is not a problem. But many people in this country do consider it a problem. Second, there are good ways and not so good ways of promoting English language learning. I probably also don't need to convince anybody here in this room that people who come to live in this country and plan to stay here and be successful here do need proficiency in English. So I want to state that off the bat. I'm not arguing that these folks don't need English. What I'd like to question is how we go about getting them to English, and do we have to sacrifice the heritage language when we do it? And that's my third point. People have a right to maintain their heritage language and not be accused of anti-Americanism or of rejecting mainstream society. I'm basically calling for sort of I and lots of other people, a shift in a paradigm, right? This country was founded with a certain linguistic culture that I'm gonna talk to, and the immigration trends that we're seeing, I think, are really encouraging us to consider an alternative paradigm as far as language. So first question off the bat, is English the official language of the United States? You'd be surprised to know how many people think that it is. We all sort of agree tacitly that it is de facto the language of business, government, in which many things are carried out. But nowhere is it stated that English is our national official language. There's no law, there's no constitutional amendment, there's nothing. Okay? Shirley Bryce Heath argues that the founding fathers recognized that language choice should be made at the local and regional levels, according to what citizens wanted in those areas. She also recognized the close connection between language and religious and cultural freedoms. So if you start legislating language, you're legislating culture, which many would argue is antithetical to what we do here in the US, okay? We're going to explore some other bits of evidence for that as well. One thing I see a lot is, on different boards and listservs and things that I go to, posts, people put on blogs and they post stuff. Why don't they just learn English? Okay? It's a fair question, but the fact is that they do. They are learning English. Immigrant communities shift entirely to English very quickly, quicker now than they did in the past, in fact. And this study is a little bit old, but it's from '75. What it does indicate is when you look at different nations around the world, in no other country did people shift to monolingualism more quickly than they do here. So this learning of English, it is happening. Veltman is one of the primary researchers in this area. Just looking at the first 5 years in the United States, 20% of immigrants who are children had already adopted English as their preferred usual language. It's incredibly fast when you look at an immigrant family, how quickly those children will begin using the language of society with each other. And in just an example that's not even truly of immigration, but just a personal one, Maggie mentioned that we lived in Oaxaca all of last year. And after about 4 months in Oaxaca, with my 7-year-old and my 6-year-old attending school all day long in Spanish, they would come home and play with each other in Spanish when none of their little friends were even around. And that I thought was incredible after only 4 months. We do know from the census reports anyway, that foreign-born home Lote speakers over the age of 5 report speaking English well or very well. 65% of them. Now, what do you think when people are asked, how well do you speak X-ish? Do people tend in a self-report to overestimate or underestimate their abilities? They tend to underestimate their abilities. I've seen it time and time again. Oh, my X-ish is terrible. And then you give them some type of, you speak with them or you give them an exam of some kind and they know a lot, okay? So I think it's probably higher than this 65% that we're seeing here. But if you're going to use that 65% figure, that means that 35% had limited English proficiency. So this is by far not the raging, they're not learning English problem that people think it is. I think what happens is when someone speaks English with an accent, right? A strong foreign accent, people automatically assume that they don't know English or they're not learning English or their English isn't good enough, okay? Because in this country, it's not enough to learn English. You have to forget everything else too, right? That's the price of admission. Leave that other stuff at the door. We don't want it here, right? And here it's broken down by language. I just pointed out it was 65% overall. And this here, it's broken down by language. So we see that certain language groups are doing better, at least in their claims of how well they speak English. Others, a little less well. And I should also point out, it's really easy to say go learn English, but there's a shortage of ESL classes. One recent study showed that of the free ESL programs in 12 different states, they had waiting lists that were extraordinarily long. Even if you have an abundance of free ESL classes, you often have folks who are working 2 or 3 jobs. When you're working 16 hours a day, it's tough to go to ESL classes. Childcare is often an issue. There's often sometimes an issue of these sort of patriarchal family units where they won't sort of allow the woman to go to ESL classes. So in fact, I had lunch today with somebody who told me that her father would not let her mother go to ESL classes. And so one thing that people have found to be successful is when you offer ESL classes in a religious context, so a church, a temple, a mosque, right? And you provide daycare, childcare, right? That ends up being quite successful in getting community members into ESL classes. But again, if they're working, they can't go to these ESL classes. So that's something very important to keep in mind. We all know how the immigrant workforce is doing a lot of our manual labor jobs, and they're working very hard at them. And so we expect them to be doing this work for us, but how can we also insist that they magically learn English the moment they show up? It's very, very difficult to reconcile these two visions. Now, some people think, well, we should just pass English-only legislation. This will solve the problem. If we made English our official language, then everybody who immigrates here would learn it. Okay? Is that a good idea? Well, we know that actually it's up from 28. I believe it's 31 now. States have declared English their official language. Even though we have nothing federally, we have things at the state level. Only 3 states have any kind of protected bilingualism. We have Hawaiian, French in Louisiana, and then Spanish in New Mexico. I'd like to talk to you. Crawford, I think, says it better than anybody else. Why is official English not the best way to go about getting people to learn English? He's got 6 reasons. He says official English policies are, first of all, unnecessary. The overwhelming dominance of English in this country is not threatened. Newcomers are learning it more rapidly before. And does it really need legal protection? In this line of thinking, it would sort of be like legislating that the sun be our official source of light and heat, or that oxygen be the official thing that we breathe. That is just sort of silly. Worse than silly, some consider it punitive. Okay? First of all, you are restricting government's ability to communicate in other languages, right, by declaring only English, which, according to this argument, would threaten the rights and welfare of many people, including U.S. citizens who are not fully proficient in English. He argues that it's useless. It really offers no practical assistance to anyone wanting to learn English. And in fact, it might frustrate that goal, right, by outlawing communication with immigrants about programs that could help them integrate into society. It feels somewhat divisive in another perspective. It kind of, he argues here, serves as a proxy for hostility towards minority groups, right? Because it's kind of not cool anymore to say, well, some people still do say, I don't like those immigrants, or I don't like those Hispanics, or I don't like those Chinese people. So where, in the circles in which that kind of discourse has become distasteful, people can sort of couch that distaste, that sentiment, right, in language. You know, it's fine if they're here, but they should just learn English, right? And as you very astutely pointed out earlier, if you look at immigration, this is where Europe is the blue one. That's where immigration was coming from in our country's history. And what you're starting to see now is Latin American and Asian immigration more than anything. So I think this is a bit startling to some members of our country. Some would argue that it's inconsistent with American values, and some places have declared these laws unconstitutional. Excuse me, because they violate guarantees of freedom of speech and equal protection of the laws. Finally, some would say, look, it's just kind of self-defeating. In an era of globalization where people are more and more looking to reach out and connect with each other, multilingual skills are very important. Why not conserve and develop these skills and not suppress them? Right? To what end would we try to suppress linguistic diversity? I'd like to return back to this point about it being punitive and divisive. Every country has its linguistic climate, its linguistic culture. Right? Some are a little more diverse than others. India, Switzerland, we can probably all think of places where it's the norm to be multilingual. In fact, do you know what % of the world's peoples are multilingual? If you had to guess, what % of the world do you think? A little bit higher, actually. I've read 65, I've read 66% of the people in the world are multilingual. You probably wouldn't know that just if you were just in the U.S., in some parts of the U.S. anyway. I want to talk about certain cases of linguistic repression that have occurred fairly recently. This was and these are just the cases that make the news. Who knows what's going on that doesn't make the news? This was a acrimonious custody battle in which the judge in Texas told the mother that speaking to the daughter in Spanish was child abuse. It was a form of child abuse, and he threatened to remove the child from her custody if she continued to do that, because you are relegating her to the position of a housemaid. And this is a judge, all right? In East Phoenix, children told police that their teacher were hitting or slapping them for speaking Spanish. Not 1950, 2003. These things are still happening. In Manhattan, these 4 young women were hired for speaking Spanish so that they could speak with clients, but then they were fired for speaking Spanish because they spoke Spanish on their breaks to each other. Now, the EEOC does have a say in language matters. The EEOC says that you can make language-based decisions to the extent that they affect the carrying out of your job. So let's say that Sephora hired me to sell cosmetics at their store, and then I went in there and I refused to speak any English, right? Just flat out refused. They could fire me for that, right? Because that's interfering with my ability to carry out my job. They cannot fire me for speaking whatever. I can speak Martian if I want, in the break room, with my colleagues, etc. That is not interfering with my job, and they could not legally fire me for that. But that's what happened here. Kansas City, Missouri, and you might think these are all anecdotal cases, but they add up. This kid is Hispanic, and he said no problema, which we all know isn't Spanish anyway. He was suspended for that, and the principal defended that. Yes, I don't want that here, she told the boy's father. She decided to reverse it, let him back in the school, but he's suing her anyway. He's like, that's just wrong, and I want to change that. Dallas, Texas, people would get pulled over for legitimate traffic violations. But when the officer thought that the person didn't speak English well enough, he'd give him a ticket for not speaking English. Which is funny, but it also makes you want to cry. Because there's nothing on the books about this. So now the city has to track down these people and clean up their driving over. There's also a couple of cases that I didn't put here. Those valedictorians who want to say something to their parents, right? There was 2 Vietnamese cousins about 2 years ago in Louisiana who said a few words of thanks to their parents in Vietnamese, caused a huge uproar. There was a young man just in June of this year. He got up and said, I'm sorry, all of y'all who don't speak Spanish, but I'm giving this valedictorian address in Spanish. And he went on and gave the whole thing in Spanish. And I'll let you go Google that and read what people had to say about that. It was quite impressive. Now here's an entirely different approach. The mayor of New York City, a couple years ago, required that all city agencies that have direct interaction with customers who don't speak English strongly had to provide assistance in those languages, either in person or by telephone for some of the less common languages. And his argument here was that if we are spending all this money on these services, but the immigrants don't understand us, and they can't come in and utilize these services, then they're absolutely wasted. Okay, we need some kind of bridge to help them get into the fabric of society. Now, of course, there are people who would respond to this, well, if 80% of our citizens are monolingual in English, I don't want my tax dollars going to translate voting documents, driver's licenses, etc., into non-English languages. Won't that remove their incentive? If they can live their life and vote and go to Kentucky Fried Chicken and do everything they want in X-ish, why should they learn English? They have no incentive to learn English. Well, that's a pretty naive argument. As we've just seen, there are people dying to get into these ESL classes. Most people know that they need to learn English, and most people are learning English. Yes, we can see when some people immigrate at a more advanced age, right? The abuelitas, they might not ever learn English very well. But most people who are forming part of the fabric of mainstream society want to and do learn English. yeah, and I just explained earlier what Bloomberg's quote was. There are things that the law requires people to do here, and if we don't communicate that to them, then we're putting them at an extreme disadvantage. So that was his arguments. Now, there's this myth that kind of circulates about my grandparents. Can anybody guess what the my grandparents or great-grandparents myth is?
They learned English right away.
By golly, when they showed up from Hungary, they didn't need any services. These immigrants today, they want everything handed to them, right? Now, the truth of the matter is, it's probably the case that when those people immigrated, you didn't really need very strong knowledge of English to make a living wage. Back when we were more of an industrious or a factory-based economy, you really didn't need strong levels of literacy, for example, in English. Since we've shifted to more of a service-oriented, now tech-oriented economy, English is becoming more and more important. So we definitely, I think, need to provide people with the means and the resources to acquire the English that they need. So how about instead of legislating English, how about do something that would really actually help someone learn English? And this fella, anybody know who he is? Lamar Alexander from Tennessee. He actually proposed a bill that would have given legal immigrants vouchers to pay for English classes. Now this to me is listen to his rationale. Most education policy, as you know, in this country is state. We don't have federal educational, we have some directives, but we don't have a federal education curriculum or policy, etc. He argues that it is the prerogative of the federal government to help people. Notice he uses the word help, and he put his money where his mouth is. He wants to help people learn English. So this strikes me as a lot more feasible way, instead of just legislating it and saying, you figure it out, right? This is actually helping people try to acquire English. So we've just looked at the evidence that people are shifting, immigrants are shifting very quickly to English, or acquiring, I should say, acquiring English. Now, what about the maintenance of the heritage language among the descendants, okay? We have this very typical pattern. Two people immigrate to the US as adults, let's say from China, and they speak Mandarin, okay? They're monolingual in Mandarin when they show up. They will acquire certain amounts of English during their lifetime here, okay? Their children are born here. Or maybe let's say they brought their children before the age of 5. Sociolinguistically, we call them second generation. They're the first generation born here, that's what sociolinguists call them, but we call them second generation linguistically. Those kids, what's going to end up being stronger for them? Their Chinese or their English? Their English ends up being stronger than their Mandarin, okay? Depending on some of the factors that we looked at in the beginning, they may end up with quite strong levels of Mandarin, okay? Now what about their kids, the grandchildren of those immigrants? Are they going to have Mandarin proficiency? Probably not. It could depend on a number of things, but that's the typical pattern of language loss, okay? Our linguistic climate, our linguistic culture aims to erase non-English languages. So one might argue that it's by design that that happens, okay? When you think about it, when these kids, like this Mandarin-speaking child that I just posited, so this kid goes to school, maybe they show up to school monolingual in Mandarin. They don't speak a lick of English. They show up to school and it's English, English, English. They might have some bilingual education, but most bilingual education, there's nothing bilingual about it. It's ESL. That's what the goal is. So it's English, 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 K through 8th grade. So then they get to high school, and now we'll have you study a foreign language. So that kind of strikes me as a squandering of a resource right there. What happened to all those years when we could have been developing literacy? We could have been developing a lot of different skills in the heritage language. And what's interesting is that the more quality instruction that you give in the home language, this is completely counterintuitive. Really hard to get people to wrap their heads around. And later on I'm going to show you some data from Houston, but they found the same thing all over the nation. The more quality instruction in the home language, the greater the English acquisition and the overall academic achievement in the long run, okay? This doesn't make any sense, right? Because if I want to learn how to play golf, I go and play golf. I don't play tennis. If I want to learn how to play tennis, I go and practice playing tennis. I don't play golf, right? But if I want to learn English, I should keep talking in Chinese. I should study in Chinese. Yes. That's what the research is showing, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I want to talk a little bit more about our linguistic culture here in the U.S. Have you ever heard any of these phrases? Have you ever been out in public speaking a language other than English and you got the stink eye? Yeah? Have you ever had somebody say something to you? You're in America, speak English? If it's a PG-13 response, what do you respond to these people? If you can say it in public. Yeah, what do you respond?
I guess what I've just said before is I kind of just like brush it off. I don't really get it all that often. But if I'm like speaking with my grandma or something, I'm just like, you know what? She might need the extra help, so.
Okay. Does anybody else have a response that they've said to somebody who's made this comment to them? You're in America, speak English? No? Okay. Well, I've had some people say, wow, some really wild things when they respond. Well, you know, Spanish was here first, or this is a free country, or we don't have a national language, or, you know, any of these other arguments, and a couple of nasty words they've said as well. Why should I have to press 1 to hear English? Have you ever heard anybody complain about this? Yeah? It's so rude because you're talking about those people. They're going to think you're talking about them. Yeah? That strikes me as kind of egotistical. I mean, really? You think that they're talking about you? Like they got nothing better to talk about, right? Nice t-shirt? Yeah. Here's a great little ditty. Ready for this?
Please speak English. English is my language, it's the language of this land. And every sign that's posted here I should understand. I do not live in China, Mexico, no foreign place. And English is the language of these United States.
There's a lot going on in that video. There's a lot going on there. What are some of the things that you notice about some of the symbolism that's happening? Yeah?
Southern accents.
Southern. Southern accent and Southern music. Country music. I don't know if it's country or Western. I don't know the difference. But
The Statue of Liberty.
Statue of Liberty, which is supposed to be giving us their
Freedom.
tired and poor and hungry, and as long as they speak English, yeah.
Invoking some military symbolism.
I noticed that right away, this military service, this pride, this,
I thought it was, oh, sorry, was it you? Go ahead. Okay, I thought it was really interesting the line she said how we don't ask too much to share these United States. Last I checked, it's not that easy to immigrate.
we do ask quite a bit, yeah,
I noticed that they were in front of a White House.
Interesting, okay, yeah.
I thought it was ironic growing up in Detroit way back in the 50s and 60s. There were a lot of Appalachians who were moving here to work in the auto industry. And people who were born in Detroit often thought that they were backward, that they were illiterate, that they were hillbillies.
Right.
Lots of negative stereotypes that we don't want you here if you can't speak proper English.
Right.
You're not ready for it.
Right.
So there's that spectrum there.
Indeed, it's similar discursively, right. Anything else? Unfortunately, it's a really catchy song. I woke up this morning, because I reviewed this presentation last night, and I woke up this morning with that song in my head. I invite you to Google it and watch the rest if you want to, if you can handle it. But you know, they're not alone. This is not some fringe thing. I don't know if I could venture to guess what % of our population feels this way. But I think it's a much larger number than I'm comfortable with. But anyway, as we've shown, this woman really has not, she doesn't like seeing the signs. It offends her. This is my country. If it's here, it should be in a language that I understand. She doesn't want any of that other stuff polluting her landscape of what she feels belongs here, okay? even though we've already looked at evidence that immigrants, not only are they learning English, they're losing their heritage languages. Just another study in Southern California, they looked at Spanish, Tagalog, that's not like a fire drill, is it? No. Okay. Chinese, Vietnamese, and Korean, and unlike the 3-generation language shift that we just talked about a moment ago, they were finding in 2 generations. I mean, as a mother, I can think of nothing more sad than the possibility of not being able to communicate with my own children. It's bad enough when the grandparents can't speak with their grandchildren, but what we're seeing, particularly with the Vietnamese-speaking community in Los Angeles, is that parents cannot communicate with their children, with their own children, because the children don't learn Vietnamese, the parents don't learn good enough English to parent, right? And I don't know, do they want to parent in English? I mean, how do you transmit family values? How do you communicate who you are in a language that you were not parented in? It's very difficult. I mean, I'm raising my children bilingually in English and Spanish. I speak to them a lot of Spanish, but I have never, ever said to either one of them, te quiero in Spanish. Like, I can't say I love you in Spanish. I can't. It comes out in English, because that's, so asking a parent to parent in English, I think is asking a bit much. So we saw, again, Spanish being gone by the 3rd generation, Asian languages were gone by the 2nd generation. So the shift is occurring very, very rapidly, and at what cost to family unity? Some have posited we see a large, unfortunately, amount of gang membership among these Vietnamese youth. And so, of course, I can't posit real causality here. I'm not going to say it's because their parents can't speak with them, but I don't think it's unrelated. Okay, so family unity, things like this, is that what we really want to sacrifice for the sake of all English? So, you know, languages come here to die, pretty much. They are dying, or as some people like to say, shift happens. Get it? Shift happens. So these people who are worried, you know, I'm not so sure what they're worried about. They just don't want any of it at any time. The minute you come here, just stop doing that other stuff because we don't want it here. Okay? Also, those who are in the mainstream are not so very good at learning foreign languages in general. Now, that's not true on this campus. I have plenty of evidence that, at least in the Spanish department, you guys are doing a great job, your students and the faculty. The Spanish just blew my mind of a lot of the young people I spoke with today. But in general, you probably know this joke. What do you call a person who speaks 3 languages? What do you call a person who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call a person who speaks 1 language? American. Yeah. Have you ever heard somebody say, you know, I studied 3 years of French in high school, and I can't remember any of it. And they're like proud. None of that stuck to me, by golly, because I'm American, you know? This is how we roll, right? Do you remember when Obama said this? Do you remember the collective convulsion in certain parts, you might say, discursive parts of this country? I mean, this was pretty out there. The country was not ready to hear this idea. Right? I wrote him a letter after he said that. I was like, yes. Now you need to appoint somebody in your cabinet whose sole job it is to help this happen. He didn't write back, but... How long does it take to learn a language? A very long... Okay. They've taken, for English speakers, okay, they've classified languages. Now, some people debate this quite severely, okay? But Category 1 languages taking this number of class hours for... And what does proficiency mean? I think here they're talking like intermediate, mid, on the ACTFL scale. Category 2... and Category 3 languages. So we're spending an awful lot of time and money, those of us who aren't like studied 3 years and don't speak a word, those of us who really are earnest and trying to learn other languages, we're investing an awful lot of time and money as a nation to learn them. What if we also retain the languages that all these immigrant children bring? The syntax that a 4-year-old has, I'm sorry, is way beyond the syntax that any of us would ever develop, right, studying as a foreign language. given the time and resources that we're investing, this just seems to me that we're squandering resources that we have right here. They already have linguistic and cultural knowledge that takes for, have you ever studied a language for a real long time? You thought you were all that, and then you went abroad, right? And you were like, wow, no, yeah, I need to stay here about 6 years, and then maybe I'll be able to have a conversation with the fish vendor, maybe, right? These folks tend to have that type of proficiency, right? Now, how can you do it? Now, this is a very complicated question. I don't have the magic bullet, but I've thought about this a little bit. There are things that we can do. We can have programs that are truly bilingual. Bi as in two. Bi as in we are working to maintain that heritage language at the same time that we are adding English. I'll give you an example of those in a minute. Offering courses for heritage speakers at the high school and university levels. We talked at great length this morning about when you've got a lot of heritage speakers, but you treat them as if they were second language learners, and you use a book and a program and a design, not only is it a complete linguistic mismatch, it can be very alienating to those students. They're often made to feel that the way they speak is not correct, it's not standard, it's not prestigious. They're told, no, you're wrong. They get the red pen. Right? So their linguistic tails between their legs, right? Even though they come with such rich strengths. So oftentimes educators are misinformed and I think doing more harm than good with some of our heritage speakers. We also have a lot of community efforts. There's Saturday heritage schools in Chicago. Every Polish kid you'd ever meet was dragged to Saturday Polish school. They hated every second of it. But when they grew up, they all say that they were grateful that their parents dragged them there because their Polish now is so strong, they can write, they can read, etc. Chinese Saturday schools as well. We don't seem to have a lot of Spanish Saturday schools, and that's interesting. Sponsoring trips abroad, local libraries having books. I sometimes encourage parents, go to libraries and read, salud, in your heritage language, etc. Now, what is a truly bilingual program? What we call bilingual ed, as I already mentioned to you, is really about ESL, most of the time. There are some exceptions. One of them is what we call dual immersion. And up here in Minnesota, you guys are very lucky. You have quite an impressive number of immersion schools, right? Dual immersion is another interesting model. What you have, half the children, in an ideal model, are native speakers of the heritage language. And the other half of the children are Anglophone, monolingual kids whose parents want them to learn that language. So the idea is that the children learn from each other. They speak half the day, in this case Spanish, half the day in English, and the children serve as models to each other. In one-way immersion, the teacher is the sole source of input in Spanish, salud, or in Chinese, or in French, or in whatever, to the children. In this model, they help each other. And what these kids can do in Spanish after 9 years, so K through 8th grade, is astounding, the amount that they learn. And those heritage speaker kids retain their Spanish as well, probably to a greater degree than they would in any other program, right? Now, here's that study that I said earlier that I was going to mention to you. What these folks did was they compared when you take language minority students, okay, these were all Spanish-speaking kids. So kids shows up to school and they have English language needs. Okay, they're deemed ELLs, English language learners. They compared kids in a transitional program, which means you get 3 years of ESL and then you're out the door. You're in the mainstream classroom, okay? To kids who had some maintenance where they said, okay, we'd like you to maintain your Spanish. They gave them a little bit of Spanish to maintain it. And with the dual immersion, which is what I just talked about. Okay, now, if you test these kids in first grade, and then in 3rd grade, and then in 5th grade, which kind of kids do you think are going to read better in Spanish? Right. Who's probably going to write better in Spanish? Who's probably going to read and write better in English? Ooh, have you seen this presentation already? Most people assume, well, time on task. These kids spent more time in English, so their English is going to be better. But here's what you find. They found this, I'm showing you Houston, but they found the same thing in Los Angeles. They found the same thing recently, I think, in New York. It's all over anywhere you look. So the yellow is the two-way, okay? Here's your two-way kids, here's your developmental kids, and here's your get into English as quick as possible, kids. Okay? So this surprises no one. If you spent all day or half the day in Spanish, of course you're going to read in Spanish better than if you didn't. Okay? Here is math. They gave them math tests in Spanish. Again, this probably surprises no one. Here is writing in Spanish. Dual immersion kids are going to write better in write better than kids who were in English all day long. Okay? But here's the shocking part. Here's the English reading. Here is the English math. And here is the English language arts. Okay? So, the writing rather. So the moral of this story is, the more high quality instruction you can give these kids in their L1, their first language, the better is going to be their development, not only in the L2, which in our case is English, but also in academic areas. Now, why might this be? Why might this be? Well, one reason that they've postulated is that when you've got this 5-year-old kid who shows up to kindergarten and struggles with English, what's happening in their content? What's going on with their learning of content? They're not getting it. So the